Do you struggle to socialize and especially enjoy being social while staying sober? Do you feel like life is a constant snowballing of overwhelm that you just cannot escape unless you go for a smoke, for example? If you do, then this video might be for you. So first of all, hello there, my darling humanoids, androids, reptiloids, asteroids, or whatever way you like to identify yourself. My name is Maria. I'm a holistic therapist. And today, well, okay, not today, a few days ago, I got prompted to speak on the topic of sobriety and why it matters and why it not just matters, but how it can actually massively benefit your life and actually just boost you up in so many ways and take you to a whole other quality of life in general. Because I was speaking to one of my clients and we were talking through their traumas and why they're making the choices that they're making. And they brought up the idea that they feel like they constantly have to drink to kind of escape themselves. And obviously, this is not the only and the first or a unique person who is saying that to me. Honestly, the amount of people that I'm encountering that openly just state that they're drinking to escape their concerns while also consciously choosing to continue to do so, it's extremely baffling to me because, in my mind, but obviously that's me, that if I know that I'm participating in some behavior that is not helpful to me, and that I know isn't healthy for me, I just stop doing it. But obviously, there is so many factors that go into somebody choosing to not follow the path of health and choosing consciously to participate in negative behavior. So I'm not coming to this from a point of judgment. However, it is still baffling to me how many people out there, especially people that I know, even friends of mine, who know that what they're doing is detrimental to them and their both physical and mental health, the fact that they're aware that it is going to have so many negative consequences on them, yet they still choose to carry on participating and unable to escape the cycle. So, unfortunately, although there is this tendency that for a lot of people, until they're pushed to the very edge, until they're left no choice but to make a change, they don't change. I'm still hoping that by making a kind of video that motivates people to perhaps make more well informed and more conscious choices in their life, I might help somebody out and motivate them to, you know, choose to be sober. Just because it is genuinely such a life hack, at least from what I found, and okay, not just I found, but literally anybody who is successful in my surroundings who I know of have found, is that if you want to accomplish something in life, if you want to get big, if you want to make it big, you have to at least go through a really long period of just absolute sobriety, clarity of mind, and everything that's included in that. If not, stay sober forever, because honestly, some of the best people that I know, some billionaires that I know, oligarchs, stuff like that, the reason why they're so successful is because they're continuously staying sober, they're participating in conscious practices, they do things like yoga, they go to retreats all the time, do detoxes all the time, they read the Kabbalion and traditional texts in Sanskrit, such as the Bhagavad Gita and so on and so forth. They read all of the Buddhist teachings, and in general, I do find it quite funny because all of the practices that are currently like in the media portrayed as woo-woo, like astrology, numerology, being into all of the Eastern teachings and, going to psychics and stuff like that, like all of those things is exactly what all of the like top 1% billionaires, at least that I know of, practice. Like, I'm not going to disclose who, but quite a lot of oligarchs are really into all of those same things as well, like yoga, conspiracies as well. Honestly, the number of conspiracies that I hear, like honestly, I hear probably more conspiracy theories and like more discussions of sacred geometry and fractals and stuff like that from like the oligarchs in my circles than I do from just like normal, I don't know, art students, for example. Well, okay, not art students, but just like artists that surround me. And I find it quite funny. That is me spiraling out from the point. So, if we talk in terms of achieving life success, right? From the experience that I've had, once again, speaking to some extremely successful individuals, the way that they got successful, one of the main things that helped them take that massive leap from just like being a normal standard human being. I'm not gonna say like living in the matrix, because honestly I've discussed this in so many videos already that it doesn't matter what level of life you're at, you're always going to be in the matrix as long as you exist physically. But just like going from the stage of just like being a standard kind of worker in the system to then being like an extremely successful entrepreneur, billionaire, investor, whatever, whatever, whatever. It always takes the stage of just absolute hermit mode, absolute sobriety, and absolute 100% focus and concentration on the mission that one has set up. And so, once again, what that stage usually starts with is a choice to go sober. So, before that, once again, oftentimes what happens is that there is this breaking point that really originally pushes the individual to actually have a vision, to actually envision something and decide that they need a change. And then after that is when one decides that, okay, to enact this change, I need to have a clear mind. And clarity of mind comes with full on sobriety. So, why is it such a keystone and how does it actually work? So, first of all, let's talk about the most common drug, because objectively, I'm sorry, but it is a drug that pretty much everyone who's an adult participates in at least at one point or another. Alcohol. So we'll start with the most common one. Aside from sugar, okay, so the only thing that's worse than alcohol is sugar, but sugar is a whole other topic and it's a bit difficult to get rid of in your daily life, especially if you can't like grow your own food, because honestly, sugar is everywhere. But like aside from sugar and coffee, from the genuinely like products that are consumed for the sake of escapism and as a crutch is alcohol as the most common one. So aside from the obvious health risk factors such as getting diabetes, heart problems, liver problems, kidney stones, cancer, liver cancer, just all sorts of ulcers and blah 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 blah. Aside from all of those like obvious physical conditions that are caused by alcohol consumption, there is also the mental factor of alcohol. So if you're unaware, alcohol is what is called a downer drug. So there's the uplifters, there's the psychedelics, and then there's the downers. So if you want to understand the different categories, essentially the uplifting substances are those that get you more focused and concentrated. They make you more energized, but not necessarily. It's more about the focus and zoomed in concentration or something. So things such as actually sugar, caffeine, and then obviously the more harmful substances, which I'm not going to say out loud, but I'm just going to list here. So essentially, the way that they work is they stimulate your nervous system, which in turn means that you're more focused and concentrated. But on the other side, it means that you have elevated levels of cortisol, which is the stress hormone in your blood that is also being released simultaneously. So that is kind of one of the main issues with them. And then we have our downers, such as once again alcohol, things like CBD, and a list of other substances that I'm going to list here, and I'm not going to speak out loud just in case. But essentially, the way that they work is that they downregulate your nervous system. So it's not that they necessarily calm you down, but essentially they numb your nervous system, which also, ironically, still stimulates the cortisol release in your system, but in a different way. So they function slightly differently. But the consequences at their core are negative for the exact same reason as the uplifting substances, is that it basically dysregulates the hormone releases in your blood. The downers, in contrast to the uplifting substances, once again, what they do is they make you less focused, obviously. So it's not that they mellow you out, but they just kind of blur you out. That is probably the best way to describe it. Is essentially you can say that a downer substance is anything that makes you more blurry. Not necessarily relaxed, but just blurry. And then we have a whole separate category of its own, which is psychedelic substances. I wouldn't say that I approve of it, more of the other two categories, but I would say that psychedelics, and especially very, very particular ones of them, do have a reasonable application in a controlled and therapeutic environment. So I would say that in my eyes, this is just like me voicing my personal opinion as a holistic therapist. Unless you really know how to work with the substances yourself, unless you're a therapist yourself and you're ready to take full accountability and responsibility for your health and the outcomes of your choices, I would say that no substances that are either stimulating or destimulating are good or should be taken. But psychedelics, if you need them for therapeutic purposes, in my eyes, they're essentially the same as any other medication that is out there on the market as actual medication. So, kind of similarly to something like paracetamol, where you wouldn't just take a paracetamol unless you have pain. But if you do have really, really strong pain that you can't just tolerate to get away from on your own, then yeah, go on and take some paracetamol. But even then, it's better to go and get it professionally prescribed to you, like the right amount, so that you don't overdo it. And so, in my eyes, psychedelic medicine is kind of the same, where unless you actually need it, unless there's an actual need for reasons of you experiencing some kind of pain or trauma, then just don't take them. But if the pain that you're experiencing is so inescapable and you just can't find any other way to solve it, then with an appropriate therapist, with an appropriate professional supporting you throughout this path, go for it. That is my view. But so back to why I believe no substances should be taken overall as a concept, and back to our example of alcohol. So, right, the main reason why people initially, I believe, get into drinking alcohol or smoking cigarettes and basically consuming any substance is obviously as a social factor. So, the way they usually starts is that a person is at some parties with some friends, even with family, and they get offered some, and they're like, oh, okay, cool, let me try it. They try it, and they see that it is so much easier to engage with other human beings while they're on alcohol or on the substance, because their limitations, their um, inner fears, their restrictions in their mind get kind of lifted up, get thrown out of the window, and they just don't maintain a lot of the typical filters that they would be applying in their normal day-to-day social interactions. And honestly, at this point, I feel like a lot of the times for a lot of people, alcohol is just an excuse for them to break out of their social barriers. Because sometimes what I notice happens is that people don't even drink that much, but they start acting so much differently than they would have otherwise, just because they now have this excuse that, oh yeah, I've been drinking and that's why I'm acting this way. Whereas instead, they could have just taken accountability for the fact that they don't want to act the normal way that they act, and they want to like play about a bit and, have some fun and just act crazy just for the sake of doing it, instead of like making up this whole excuse of going to get a drink and stuff like that in order for them to make it reasonable enough to be acting crazy in other people's eyes. Anyway, so essentially, things like alcohol and other substances essentially at their core become a social crutch, where an individual finds it just at first easier to act the way that they want to act, to live in the moment, to be present in the moment, and to feel more free in the moment that they're in, while they're consuming the substance. And it is all fine and good when it's done initially in small amounts. But the thing is, typically, I'm sorry, but that's just the fact of life. People start doing things like that at a pretty young age, and they don't realize that there needs to be control in the amount of stuff that they consume. So they end up spiraling out and consuming more and more and more, because they realize that as they keep consuming a particular substance, their tolerance starts to raise. And as the tolerance starts to raise, more and more needs to be consumed. And then if a person wants to go even wilder, wants to have even more of an excuse to act crazy, or wants to experience more extreme states of being, states of consciousness, they also consume more. And as they consume more, their tolerance raises more. And as their tolerance raises more, they need to consume more. And it becomes this perpetual cycle. And so essentially, the main issue becomes that at a point of the cycle, the individual becomes so used to having this crutch assist them to release the limitations that they set out for themselves in their normal daily life, that they stop being able to release those limitations themselves while they're in full consciousness and awareness. So they start relying on the substances in order to provide them the freedom of spirit, the freedom of expression, and the freedom of interacting with others in the way that they want to. So essentially, the longer the cycle carries on, the more and more unable the individual becomes to act in the way that they want to act, the more disabled their sense of freedom and their sense of self is. And then oftentimes it gets to a point where the individual fully starts attributing their free self expressive self to the state of them being on a particular substance. At which point, I would say, is when it becomes a full on addiction. It stops just being a social crutch, it stops just being an excuse to have a bit more fun than usual, but an actual addiction. Is when the person essentially has a whole separate self developed and identified with a particular substance. That unless they have the substance, they cannot embrace and they do not feel like they're able to embody that other self that they have. And so, although I've just given the example of alcohol, a similar thing can be said to even stimulants such as caffeine, right? Because you have probably noticed that there's this trend of the girlies getting the iced latte and blah, 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 or just like the general office culture of constantly drinking Americano coffees, right, to stay productive. That individuals, aside from having the physical addiction to caffeine and the reliance on caffeine for stimulation and for staying focused and maintaining focus and work, it has almost become like a social phenomenon that, oh yeah, this individual is only kind of termed productive if they have had like 3 cups of coffee and are sitting there like shaking on their laptop, which is extremely toxic but essentially works in a similar way, where individuals develop a full on reliance and a full on persona that is attributed and associated to them having coffee or another stimulant in order to embrace that hyper productive, hyper focused, really workaholic self. And so, once again, aside from obviously all of the physical harm and all of the chemical harm that is caused by consuming substances, what is the kind of psychosocial issue with creating these personas attributed to particular addictions? It is the splitting of the self. So if you were unaware until now and you haven't seen any of my other videos, that is essentially what I mostly concentrate on in terms of holistic well-being, is how all of these phenomenons of health and productivity and things like that relate to just having a holistic and integrated sense of self, because that is what I have so far come to believe is at the core of achieving anything in life and actually living a full, fulfilled, and joyful, consistently happy, top notch life quality life. And so essentially, what addictions do, what consuming substances and relying on substances to change your state of being does, is it splits you into a variety of personas. And once you, as you are, get split into these different personas that you cannot fully embrace or feel integrated as when you are in your full sense of awareness, in your full conscious state, is that essentially you are just not functioning as your full self. You're not embracing the whole image, the whole picture of who you are when you are sober. So, once again, this for the context of when you are an individual who consumes substances and like drinks, for example, or does something else. But then you also obviously have time periods when you're sober. So the issue becomes is that even when you're sober, the sober self, the sober you stops being the full you because you have this whole other you that is attributed to you on substances. And therefore, when you're the sober you, it is one self, and then you have another self, which is you on the substances. And that other self is the aspect that can end up leading you to self sabotage. That other self becomes one of your shadows, it becomes one of your unconscious drivers. So you can bring it to consciousness when you're on the substance, but then when you're on the substance, it flips over, and then your sober and conscious self becomes your shadow while you're on the substance. So you kind of become polarized in yourself, just depending on your state of being and whether you're sober or not. And essentially, the key to becoming a successful individual and almost guaranteeing that you achieve exactly what it is you want to achieve in life. And it is also the key to staying in flow with the universe, being in touch with your inner self, being in touch with the higher powers, being in touch with your soul. All of these things that so many people are striving for right now, they root down in just this need, this requirement to consciously integrate your full self, to eradicate anything that might be hidden, that might be repressed within you. there might be your shadow. There might be something that you're trying to avoid or escape. Essentially, all of the best things in this universe that you want stand behind you fully accepting, fully integrating, and fully becoming what it is that you are as an individual on every single level. As an ego, as a persona, as an animus or anima, as the unconscious, as the conscious, all of these aspects have to become united and aligned in order for you to get exactly what you want. Because if there's any disturbances, if there's anything that is out of balance within you, when all of those aspects of you are not perfect in perfect alignment and feeding each other and positively impacting each other, if any of them are out of line, you will somehow sabotage things. There will be something that prevents you, there will be some fears that arise, there will be inner conflict, which ends up majorly impacting your success rate. But another aspect that is also super key to success, aside from this internal, full integrated alignment and holistic approach to the self, is your intuition and your intuitive capacity and intuitive ability. Because that is what, from my experience with clients and from my experience speaking to different successful people, is one of the main tools that actually drive them and take them to success, is having access to really, really clear intuition and having developed this communication with the universe, with the divine, or just with the surrounding environment, seeing all of the deeper interconnections and interrelations in the world around them, understanding at the core how it functions, both on a conscious and on an intuitive level. And in very simple terms, what not staying sober does is it represses your intuition, obviously. So when you're taking some substance, what tends to happen is that once again, your nervous system becomes disturbed, your hormones become destabilized, which impairs your access to this gut instinct that we have as creatures, as animal beings. But also because intuition is very much rooted in pattern recognition, aside from this biological, natural sense that we have. And our brain function gets impaired by a substance, then obviously our ability to recognize patterns also becomes impaired. It also becomes disturbed and distorted. Hence, our brains essentially end up not functioning at optimal levels if they're at any point influenced by a substance. And so, on the other side, not just leading a sober lifestyle, but even going as far as becoming ascetic in some sense, actually really, really can heighten your sensitivity and assist your brain in establishing a lot more neural connections a lot faster. And so, to put it quite simply, the more stuff you consume in general, the more numb to this world you become. The less you have, the more heightened sensitivity you have to the world surrounding you. In part, it is also, yes, because you become perhaps more stressed at a point because you have so little, and there's this innate human desire to accumulate and have more stuff, because having more stuff and constantly gaining and having more makes us somehow feel safer. But on the other hand, having this comfort of consumerism and consumption, especially of substances, is what leads to an individual becoming a bit too comfortable in their life and numbing themselves once again to some of the more obvious problems that might actually be present. Because when you get too comfortable in life, when you become too numb to it, you stop being as vigilant. And then when it gets to a point of becoming a full on lifestyle instead of just like an occasional thing that you do to celebrate, it can actually totally lead you down the wrong path of your life and your choices. So it can make an individual stray away from who they actually are authentically. And that is probably the biggest struggle with it. So even if we weren't going to go down this path of like getting massive success, becoming super rich, blah 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 blah, um, another really, really core issue with consumption is that it just takes you away from your authentic self because you become oblivious, you become numb to your genuine reactions and your genuine emotions and feelings that you experience towards certain situations, people, and things that take place in your life. And so when you become oblivious to them, you start tolerating things that normally the authentic you would have perhaps not tolerated. You start liking, or at least thinking that you like, things that you don't actually like, you lose the sense of resonance with the world because you lose the sense of resonance with yourself. Because once again, your intuition becomes repressed, your feelings become repressed, and therefore you just don't differentiate what you actually resonate with at your core and what you don't resonate with. And so you just kind of start accepting absolutely everything that happens in your life, which is also why it is like such an escape, which is why people do it in the first place, why people participate in all of these things in the first place, is because it makes you just more accepting of everything that happens around you. But then, yes, there is some benefit to it, but on the other hand, too much acceptance that is not stemming from the inside of the individual, from authenticity, is not good. Acceptance in general, acceptance of the world as is, acceptance of the things as they come, is a great attitude. It is a great thing that I believe everybody should strive for. However, if that acceptance comes from an external stimulant affecting you or an external thing affecting you instead of just from arising from within, then it is not authentic, it is not integrated, and it is not a part of you. And therefore, it is not you genuinely being more accepting and more loving of this world and being one and at peace with the universe. No, instead it is just a substance influencing you. And as soon as that substance gets taken away from you, you are actually further away from being the super loving and super accepting and super in flow individual than you were in the first place before you started taking the substance. Because once you start taking it, you become so used to relying on it to give you that sense of oneness, that sense of peace, that sense of joy, that when you don't have it, you actually stop being able to produce those same chemicals that enable that sense of oneness in the first place, such as oxytocin, serotonin, dopamine, all of those things. So, just in case you don't know, those are the happiness hormones, which is essentially what is responsible for us experiencing joy in general and humans experiencing the sense of wonder and oneness with the universe. So, because the natural production of those hormones gets impaired when we get used to substances, once the substance is taken away, we end up actually experiencing a kind of a drop in those same hormones in our normal daily routine. So, essentially, our tolerance for those hormones increases. And so, what an individual can find is that less and less things are actually able to stimulate the release of those same hormones in their life after they have essentially been overly stimulated by external substances. So, once again, whereas in the case of stimulants, for example, they enable an individual to reach higher levels of executive function, once the stimulants are taken away from an individual, the standard ability to actually engage becomes lower than it was at the baseline before they started participating in the substance. And in the case of downers, for example, where they're the substances that enable an individual to feel more relaxed and more kind of blurry, as I described it once again, what happens when the substance is taken away is that an individual becomes more anxious, more stressed in their daily life because, once again, their baseline ability to soothe themselves, to uh, feel into their feelings, to embrace their feelings, to communicate with others becomes worse. So, at the end, this whole sobriety thing in general is all about just becoming, once again, more in touch with who you truly and authentically are, instead of allowing all of these things to suppress and force you essentially to adhere to what is actually not truly authentically aligned with you. And reaching those super high levels of success that I have spoken of at the start of the video, aside from this aspect of authenticity, also highly relies on your ability to trust yourself. Because the thing is, even if you might lie to yourself that you fully trust yourself when you're on some substance and blah, 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 I'm sorry, but that is a lie. Because I'm sorry, but that is just the way that minds function, is that if an individual has an awareness that they participate in some substance, that they get external stimulation in some way, it makes them realize that they are not able to evoke all of those same feelings that get evoked on that substance when they're sober, and therefore, because they become aware that they cannot be what they are on that substance when they're sober, they trust themselves less when they're sober. And obviously, they already cannot trust themselves when they're under influence because they are under influence. So, what that ends up basically leading to, I feel like I've just really over complicated this explanation, is that if an individual participates in some especially addictive behavior, but not even addictive behavior, but just uses some kind of external stimulation, they lose a bit of trust in themselves because they have essentially given their power away to whatever that external stimulant or that external situation or just that external substance is. So basically, the more things you rely on outside of yourself, the less you trust yourself and the less trust you show to your own self. And then the less trust you show to your own self, the less you feel like you're actually able to achieve in life. And therefore, the less responsibility you end up feeling like you're able to take on and execute. Or even if you feel like you can take on a lot of responsibility, that can be just an individual lying to themselves and then end up sabotaging themselves because they end up being unable to reasonably measure and estimate their own capacity for work, for achievement, and so on and so forth. Because once again, an individual stops being in touch with their true authentic self, stops being integrated, and gets taken away from full self knowledge. So the way I would probably conclude this whole video, right, is that essentially, if you want to improve your life, if you want to have a higher living standard, if you want to achieve, especially something big in life, if you want to feel like you're actually living life every single second of the day, if you want to feel like absolutely everything that you do in life brings you joy, brings you true prosperity, true inner peace, and that even anything troubling that happens in your life is not an actual problem anymore, but just you start feeling like it is just yet another exciting thing to perhaps overcome. If that is the life that you want, I'm sorry, but you have to get into sobriety. You have to fully integrate holistically as an individual. You have to understand yourself, integrate every single aspect of yourself, and go sober so that you don't sabotage yourself, so that you can know that you can fully trust yourself. So, yeah, if you want to have, once again, an amazing life, embrace yourself in a holistic manner, go sober and have a good time. Have a good day. Or if you choose to not go sober, once again, just take responsibility and just stop complaining. Essentially, this is me just being like, just people need to stop complaining. Because if you have chosen to pursue some path, just like take responsibility for what you're pursuing. Stop being like, oh, poor me. Oh my God, why is my life going so badly? Because you chose for it to go badly. Just take responsibility for your life, man. It's not that difficult. And yeah, this is an outcry for holistic therapists that people just, yeah, just please become more responsible. Yeah, cool? Cool. I'll see you around.